September 11th, 1970. London, the Cumberland Hotel. A suite where the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of something ending. Jimi Hendrix sits across from Keith Altham, a music journalist who's been circling the rock scene long enough to know when someone's talking in past tense about their own life. A tape recorder sits between them, red light on, reels turning, recording what will become Hendrix's final interview, 1 week before he dies. But the way he talks, it already sounds like he's gone. Not physically, mentally. The person the world knows as Jimi Hendrix, the image, the brand, the explosion of sound and color and chaos, is describing what it feels like to be trapped inside that image, to be famous for something you can't escape, to be classified, cornered, reduced to a single definition while the rest of you suffocates. If you listen to this interview knowing what happens next, it doesn't sound like a conversation. It sounds like a warning. A map of how fame replaces your life with a picture of your life, and how once that picture is all anyone sees, the real you disappears. This is the story of Jimi Hendrix's final interview, not because he predicted his death, but because he described the mechanics of fame with such precision that it reads like prophecy. How the music industry turns artists into products. How pressure becomes a nervous system issue. How the need to escape leads to building rooms that block out reality. And how the warning he gave on September 11th, 1970 is still being ignored 50 years later. It starts earlier. Not in London. In the years before. When Hendrix is at the peak of everything the world thinks it wants from him. Post-experience. Post-Woodstock. Post-revolution. He's the guitarist who lit his instrument on fire and made it look like the most natural thing in the world. The man who turned the national anthem into a war cry. The artist who proved you could be black and psychedelic and dangerous and untouchable all at once. But behind the sold-out shows and the magazine covers and the myth, Hendrix is collapsing. Not from drugs, not from excess, from the weight of being Jimi Hendrix. Because fame doesn't just give you an audience, it gives you a role. And once the role is set, the industry builds a cage around it and calls it a career. Hendrix isn't just a guitarist, he's the guitarist, the one who has to be louder, faster, more explosive than anyone else. Every night, every show, every performance. The expectation isn't that he'll be good, it's that he'll be historic, and anything less than historic is failure. And here's the part people miss. Hendrix doesn't want to be just a guitarist. He wants to write. He wants to produce. He wants to build soundscapes that don't fit into 3-minute singles. He wants to experiment with recording techniques that don't make sense to record executives who only care about radio play. But every time he tries to move, the industry pulls him back. Because they didn't invest in Jimi Hendrix, the person. They invested in Jimi Hendrix, the image. And the image has to stay consistent, predictable, marketable. That tension, that fight between who you are and who they need you to be, is what Hendrix talks about in the final interview. And it's what he'd been talking about for months before. July 7th, 1969. Over a year before the Cumberland Hotel. Hendrix appears on The Dick Cavett Show. It's one of his rare television appearances. And if you watch it closely, you can see the cracks forming. He talks about exhaustion, about the pressure, about feeling like he's on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, matter-of-fact way that makes it more terrifying. Like he's describing symptoms of a disease he doesn't have a name for yet. Cavett asks him about the pace, the touring, the constant movement, and Hendrix responds with something that sounds like relief. Like someone finally asked the right question. He admits it's too much, that he's burning out, that the machine he's inside doesn't have an off switch, but the audience laughs. Not cruelly, just nervously, because they don't know how to process a rock star admitting vulnerability. Rock stars are supposed to be invincible, untouchable, above the normal human experience of being tired or scared or trapped. So the moment passes. Hendrix smiles. Cavett moves on, and the warning gets filed away as just another eccentric rock star being dramatic on television. But it wasn't dramatic. It was accurate. Because by 1970, Hendrix is describing fame not as success, but as classification, as being cornered, as being locked into a single identity that doesn't leave room for growth or change or complexity. And that's the thesis of the final interview. The thing Keith Altham captures on tape at the Cumberland Hotel that most people still don't understand. Hendrix talks about not wanting to be pinned into one corner, about the industry's need to categorize him, a guitar player, songwriter, performer. Pick one. Stay in your lane. Don't confuse the audience. But Hendrix doesn't fit into one corner. He never did. And the more successful he becomes, the more the corners close in. He describes this feeling of being watched, of every decision being analyzed, of the pressure to maintain the image, even when the image has nothing to do with who he actually is anymore. He talks about wanting to create in peace, to experiment without the weight of expectation, to make mistakes without them becoming headlines. And then he says something that sounds like science fiction in 1970, but feels like a blueprint for the modern world. He talks about building an audio-visual environment room, a space designed to overwhelm the senses, to calm the nervous system through controlled overstimulation, a place where you can escape reality by replacing it with something more manageable. At the time, it sounds like hippie nonsense, like another rock star talking about building a studio in the clouds. But listen to it now, in a world of VR headsets and sensory deprivation tanks and dopamine-engineered apps, and it sounds prophetic. Because what Hendrix is describing isn't just a room, it's a coping mechanism, a way to survive a world that moves too fast, demands too much, and never lets you rest. He's describing the future of escapism, the need to build artificial environments because the real world has become unbearable. And the reason he's thinking about this isn't because he's a futurist, it's because he's drowning. And he's looking for a way to breathe. But here's what makes the final interview so devastating. Hendrix isn't angry. He's not blaming anyone. He's just describing the mechanics of how fame works, how it turns a person into a product, how the industry builds a mythology around you and then expects you to live inside that mythology forever. He talks about the image, about how once the world has a picture of who you are, that picture becomes more real than you are. People don't want the complicated version. They want the version they saw on stage, the version that fits on a magazine cover, the version that makes sense. And if you try to be anything else, the industry corrects you. Not violently, just persistently. Opportunities dry up. Collaborators disappear. The machine stops supporting the parts of you that don't fit the brand. So you have a choice. Stay in the corner and suffocate, or fight your way out and lose everything. Hendrix chose to fight. And it killed him. Not literally, not directly, but the constant pressure, the exhaustion, the need to be Jimi Hendrix every single day without a break, without privacy, without the space to figure out who he was outside of the image, wore him down to nothing. And on September 18th, 1970, 1 week after the final interview, Jimi Hendrix dies in London. Asphyxiation. The official story is accidental, an overdose of sleeping pills mixed with alcohol, the kind of death that gets labeled as rock and roll excess. But if you listen to the final interview, it doesn't sound like excess. It sounds like exhaustion, like someone who spent years trying to escape a machine that wouldn't let him go. And when the tape stops rolling on September 11th, what's left isn't a prophecy of death. It's a description of what fame does to people who don't fit into the boxes the industry builds for them. Here's what most people miss about Hendrix's final interview. It's not about Jimi Hendrix. It's about the system, about how the music industry treats artists like assets instead of people, how it builds myths and then demands you live up to them, how it replaces your identity with a marketable version of your identity and punishes you if you try to reclaim it. Hendrix didn't predict his death. He described the conditions that make death feel like the only way out: the pressure, the classification, the corner, the inability to grow or change or exist outside the image. And the tragedy isn't that he died. The tragedy is that the industry heard the warning and didn't change anything. Because 50 years later, the same machine is still running. Artists are still being cornered. Images are still replacing lives. The pressure is still breaking people. And the warning Hendrix gave in a hotel room in London is still sitting on a tape that most people have never heard. Keith Altham recorded that interview because he knew it mattered. He knew Hendrix was saying something important. But the tape didn't become famous because of what it said. It became famous because of when it was recorded. 1 week before death. The timing made it a curiosity, a piece of rock history, a final message. But the message wasn't, "I'm going to die." The message was, "This is what fame does." And nobody listened. Because listening would mean admitting the industry is built on exploitation. That success isn't freedom. That the artists everyone idolizes are often the ones suffering the most. And that the image of rock and roll, the mythology of rebellion and chaos and living fast, is a lie that covers up the reality of control and classification and slow suffocation. Hendrix knew that. He said it out loud, on tape, in a hotel room in London, 1 week before he died. And the world filed it away as a lost interview, a curiosity, a piece of history, not a warning. But that's exactly what it was. September 11th, 1970. The tape stops. Hendrix thanks Keith Altham. The interview is over, and in 7 days, so is Hendrix. But the warning doesn't die with him. It sits there, waiting, for anyone willing to listen. Because the lesson of the final interview isn't about Jimi Hendrix. It's about what happens when the industry decides who you are and refuses to let you be anything else. When fame stops being applause and starts being classification. When the image replaces the person. When the corner becomes a cage. Hendrix didn't escape. He described the cage, in detail, with precision, and nobody heard him. Or maybe they heard him, and they just didn't care. Because the machine that killed Jimi Hendrix is still running, still cornering artists, still demanding they stay in their lane, still replacing lives with images, still building myths and punishing anyone who tries to step outside them. And the final interview sits there, a time capsule, a map, a warning. The system didn't lose because Hendrix spoke. It won because nobody listened. But here's what the industry doesn't want you to know. The warning didn't die with Hendrix. It echoed forward, through every artist who came after him and faced the same cage, the same classification, the same corner. And some of them heard it. Some of them understood exactly what Hendrix was describing in that hotel room. The way fame turns you into property. The way the image becomes more valuable than the person. The way the industry builds a brand around your name and then expects you to disappear inside it. Prince heard it, and he fought back harder than anyone. He didn't just fight for artistic control. He fought for ownership, for his name, for the right to exist outside the contract that defined him. And when Warner Brothers refused to let him be anything other than what they decided he should be, Prince did something the industry thought was insane. He changed his name to a symbol, an unpronounceable mark that couldn't be marketed, couldn't be packaged, couldn't be controlled. And he wrote slave on his face in public, not as a publicity stunt, as a statement, as proof that the contract he signed wasn't freedom. It was ownership. The industry mocked him, called him crazy, called him difficult, called him a cautionary tale about what happens when artists think they're bigger than the business. But Prince understood something Hendrix described in that final interview. The business doesn't see you as a person. It sees you as a revenue stream. And the moment you stop generating revenue the way they want, they replace you. So Prince fought, for years, through lawsuits and bad press and industry blacklisting. And he won, not because he was louder, but because he refused to stay in the room. He walked out. He built his own system. He proved that the corner isn't permanent if you're willing to lose everything to escape it. And when he died in 2016, the same industry that tried to break him spent weeks pretending they supported him all along, pretending they understood his fight, pretending his battle for ownership was always reasonable and justified. But they didn't support him. They tried to destroy him, just like they destroyed Hendrix. Not with violence, with pressure, with classification, with the slow suffocation of being told who you are and how you're allowed to exist, and what happens if you try to be anything else. The difference is, Prince survived long enough to win. Hendrix didn't, but both of them understood the same truth. The one Hendrix described on September 11, 1970, in a hotel room in London, 1 week before he died. The music industry doesn't build careers. It builds cages, and it calls them opportunities. It doesn't develop artists. It develops brands. And once the brand is set, the artist becomes irrelevant, replaceable, a problem to be managed. And when artists push back, when they demand to be treated as people instead of products, when they refuse to stay in the corner, the industry doesn't negotiate. It punishes. It freezes them out. It makes them examples. It destroys them financially, professionally, publicly. And then it mourns them when they're gone and pretends it was all so tragic and unavoidable. Hendrix described that cycle in his final interview. Prince lived it. And 50 years later, the cycle hasn't changed. The corners are still there. The classification is still happening. The pressure is still breaking people. And the industry is still pretending it's not responsible. Because admitting responsibility would mean admitting the system is built on exploitation. That fame isn't the reward. It's the trap. That the artists who make it to the top are often the ones being destroyed the fastest. And that the mythology of rock and roll, the rebel image, the live fast die young narrative, is just cover for an industry that chews people up and calls it a career. Hendrix knew that. He said it out loud, and the industry ignored him until he was dead. Then they sold the myth, the tragic genius, the artist who burned too bright, the inevitable end of a life lived too fast. But that's not what the final interview says. The final interview says the opposite. It says Hendrix wasn't burning too bright. He was being burned by expectation, by classification, by a machine that needed him to stay Jimi Hendrix, even when Jimi Hendrix was suffocating under that name. And the real tragedy isn't that he died at 27. The real tragedy is that the warning he gave is still true, still accurate, still ignored. Because the industry hasn't learned. It hasn't changed. It's just gotten better at hiding the cage, at making exploitation look like opportunity, at convincing artists that fame is freedom when it's actually the opposite. Prince saw through it. He called it slavery, and he fought his way out. And for that, he deserves to be remembered not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that the system can be beaten, that the corner isn't permanent, that walking away is a strategy, that refusing to be classified is an act of survival. But most artists don't survive. Most artists hear the warnings and ignore them because they think they'll be different. They think the cage won't apply to them. They think their talent will protect them. And by the time they realize the truth, they're already locked in. Hendrix realized the truth in 1970, in a hotel room in London, with a tape recorder running. And he described it with the kind of clarity that only comes from someone who's already tried every other option and found them all blocked. He wasn't predicting his death. He was explaining the conditions that make death feel like relief, the exhaustion, the pressure, the inability to exist outside the image, the corner that keeps getting smaller. And 7 days later, he was gone, and the industry moved on, found the next genius, built the next myth, repeated the cycle, and the final interview became a curiosity instead of a blueprint. But it's still there. The tape still exists, the warning is still recorded, and anyone willing to listen can hear exactly what Hendrix was trying to say. The system only wins if you stay in the room. Hendrix stayed. Prince left. And the difference between those two outcomes is the difference between a warning and a solution. September 11th, 1970. A hotel room in London. A tape recorder. A man describing a cage. And a world that refused to listen until it was too late. The interview ends. The tape stops. And the machine keeps running. But the warning remains, for anyone brave enough to hear it.